Hello, my name is Jacob Taylor. Welcome to the Polysophical channel. I have a goal to produce content more consistently, and this medium of just the audio with the waveform, this is a way that I can do it because, as I'm sure many of you have realized, life is very busy. And when you don't make any money on something that you even may love to do, it's hard to justify giving it a lot of time. So this is a way to get content out, get ideas out there in the world. And the ideas themselves are the most important part, I think. Speaking of ideas being the all-important part of this channel, you'll notice that our name is Polysophical. And I'd like to explain briefly what that is and the crest that we have as our new icon for the channel. So Polysophical, if you break down the Greek roots, it's poly meaning many, sophical deriving from the noun sophia, which, like philosophy, means wisdom. So it is the study and the pursuit of many wisdoms to be a polysophical person. And then on the crest that we have, there is a Greek phrase that's on the bottom half of the circle, and it says, alethia perigegrameni. What does this mean? Truth having been circumscribed. Because to circumscribe all truth into one great whole is our ultimate objective on Polysophical. This philosophy of integrating knowledge, that will become even more apparent as this channel continues to grow. But for now, I'll leave it at that and simply say, welcome to Polysophical. Today, instead, I would like to talk a little bit about a concept that I call the as if it were aspect of something. I'm going to explain why I'm using this clumsy phrase, as if it were, to describe what is essentially metaphor, but metaphor used in a very specific way. And as an example of what I mean by this term, as if it were, let's take a concept that I think that everybody listening will understand at an intuitive level. And that, of course, is love. Think capital L, love. What is love? Is love simply altruistic behavior, an anomaly in an otherwise selfish competition for genetic superiority? Is love simply oxytocin and serotonin being released in the brain? Is love pair bonding? Is love mate selection and pursuit? Is love not actually real? Is love a figment of our imagination? Is it a fantasy? Well, if you look at the work of my personal favorite neuroscientist / Oxford English scholar, Iain McGilchrist, he would say, no, love is in fact more real than reality itself at face value. And what does he mean by that? Love is a metaphor. And a metaphor in a very specific sort of way that's not simply a figure of speech, but the etymological meaning, maybe, of metaphor, the original meaning of metaphor. That is what he is going for. So the roots that construct this word metaphor are meta, meaning across in Greek, in this context. And then the for element comes from the verb pherein, which means to carry. So you're carrying the meaning of something across a perceived divide, a metaphorical divide even. And love is like this. And so are all of the capital V values that we really need as human beings to interpret the world in a meaningful way. You know, truth and bravery and charity and love, faith, hope, all of these sorts of things. These are right hemisphere mediated values. And as such, because the right hemisphere doesn't contain the Broca's area, which is responsible for speech formation, these things are actually quite difficult to talk about, especially in sort of abstracted or explicit terms. And so that makes it easy to devalue the values in question here, which are ultimately metaphorical. And the reason why these capital V values are so important is because they are what give life a sense of richness and context and groundedness, and anything beyond sort of what could be called a left hemisphere, obsessively utilitarian view of the world. Like the profit motive cannot be the only reason that we get out of bed and go to our job. The will to power cannot be the only reason that we interact with our fellow human beings. To engage with the world in this way has lost its metaphorical and ultimately transcendent significance. And it is characteristic of a left hemisphere way of viewing the world. And the left hemisphere, if we're being honest, it has a propensity to lead its victims towards dystopian hellscapes. And that is kind of where we seem to be headed now as a society. And so I think that it's important to re-engage with the disposition, the strengths of the right cerebral hemisphere and that mode of being in the world. And in order to do that, I have come up with this word, as if it were. Now, to explain why I use as if it were and not just metaphor or McGilchristian metaphor even. You may think as if it were is cumbersome, and I would agree with you. I'm open to suggestions. But here's the thing, is if you use McGilchristian metaphor, that is also cumbersome in terms of length, and someone has to know who McGilchrist is in order for that to make sense. But interestingly, just using the word metaphor is also cumbersome, in fact, even more so in my opinion, not because it's too long or difficult to pronounce or whatever, but metaphor, that word has a very large amount of semantic load that has already been placed upon it. See, my opinion is that when people think of metaphor, they think of, I don't know, something poetic like your eyes or the ocean, or maybe metaphors versus similes in their English class growing up. And this use of metaphor is distinctly not what I am talking about. I am not talking about simply juxtaposing words together in an interesting way as a means of description or even poetic word use. When I say metaphor, and when Iain McGilchrist says metaphor, it is a way by which to use language as a pointer towards transcendent realities that are difficult to prove, but even more difficult to live without. So that's my rationale for the necessity for a new word or phrase to describe this thing, this aspect of metaphor that is so important. But I am open to suggestions. Here are some other words, some sort of compound Greek and Latin words that I thought, hey, maybe I could use this. So one of them is ontophony. Ontos is being, phanein is to manifest, to appear. So being manifesting itself in these particular words or concepts. Perhaps a little on the nose, I know, but it's, it's available. The web domain is available. Ontophony.com is available as of, I haven't actually checked. So ontophor, here's another word. Like metaphor, but this time it's grounded in being itself. Definitely a word. Quasi-ontum or quamsi. So quamsi-ontum is the Latin translation of the phrase as if it were. Quamsi, the quamsi of love? Maybe. Ontognosis. See, that one just sounds like it got ripped off from one of those AI-generated mystic channels. Then there is a series of words that are derived from the Greek verb dokein, which is to appear, to sort of present itself, for something to appear as if. Doki imi, or the Erasmians would pronounce it doke emoi, means it seems to me, it appears to me. That phrase occurs all across ancient Greek literature, especially in Plato and Aristotle. So to take something from that dokein verb, maybe doka type, dokalithea, dokon, which is the present participle of dokeo. Anyways, there's these options. But frankly, I'm trying to steer away from doing this anyways. The sort of Greekification, Latinification, Germanification of philosophical words that are used then in English. I'll tell you why I want to use an English phrase, even if it is a little bit cumbersome. And it's largely because in English, we have become disconnected from our own etymology. We don't really use and know the roots of the foundational English language. Like, we don't use Anglo-Saxon roots to construct our words in a similar way that maybe the French Language Academy will say, no, it has to be French roots, Latinate roots, and then, in French constructions in order to port in new concepts and words. We're not just going to use loan words. In English, we are very liberal with the loan words that we adopt in. And that makes English an incredibly flexible language. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it does, I believe, disconnect us from the bodily reality of the language itself. The prepositions that we use to describe states of being, where things are going, how fast, up or down, forward or backward. These things are actually different words from the prepositional roots, the prefixes and suffixes that are used to change the meaning of a word. As an example of this, let's take the word that we used in our crest, perigagrameni, having been circumscribed. That is the meaning of that word, and sort of show what is going on there in this word. We have the peri, which means around, and then gegrameni is a perfect tense, so have been sort of thing, have been written. That's what it's saying. It's peri, around, gegrameni, having been scribed, written, having been circumscribed. But then if we were to translate that into English, what is the word that we use? What's the word I've been using? Circumscribe. To having been circumscribed. It's not having been around written. That would be the sort of more traditional English translation. Traditional, not in the sense that that's what we would do, but it's using the more Anglo-Saxon roots that I believe as English speakers we would have a more intuitive grasp of sort of the incorporeate nature of the concept. The around riding, this thing at the center, and delineating what is outside and maybe marking around what is in the center. Around marking, maybe that would be even a better translation. And the point of all of this is to say, I don't want to add to the body of abstruse Greek and Latin terms that someone has to memorize in order to engage in philosophy. As a German example, what about the word Aufhebung? And so to a German speaker, it's like upheaval or however they would think of it. And that's a word that they have in their language, and maybe it's used in a very idiosyncratic way in Hegel and Kant, but it's a word to them that they recognize. Whereas for us, we just port in Aufhebung, and you have to sort of put things into the semantic bucket of the word in order for it to have any sense value, any meaning at all. And I really want to try and avoid that. So although it is clumsy, I think to say the as if it were of love is as if it were true. I think that this is useful because it is breakable into its parts as if it were. And then you can reconstruct it in context and put new meaning to that phrase as a discrete phrase rather than having to understand Greek, Latin, German roots in the word in order to understand what's going on. Now, some of you may be wondering, Jake, how do I know that something is as if it were real and not simply a fantasy or a delusion or even psychosis, a psychotic delusion? Well, I'll tell you my thoughts on that. Ultimately, I think this comes down to a pragmatist view of epistemology, which is whether or not something works. And that's different than use value. It's not, is something useful or does something work in a sort of immediate, pragmatic, colloquial use of that word form of left hemisphere tool use or left hemisphere fitting a particular role. The pragmatists are different in the way that they see this use of the word to work. And I will absolutely admit that I need to study the pragmatist more to fully explain it in a way that makes sense. But at the end of the day, a big part of it is this. Does the thing in question cohere a person's identity? Does it cohere society successfully? Does it add positively to the goals of life, which, like I was saying before, are so much more than just the profit motive or the will to power or showing somebody up in the pursuit of status and wealth? And even beyond this, it's, does the truth in question sort of crystallize, maybe even in different ways, at different strata of society? Does it crystallize at different strata of knowledge and wisdom? Does it appear in different manifestations at different levels of consciousness development? For those familiar with Abraham Maslow or Jean Gebser or sort of the synthetic thinker Ken Wilber and what he did with all these developmental psychologists in his book, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, I'd say that the things dealt in that book, those are great examples of as if it were truths. And ultimately, these are the kinds of things that I am personally most interested in. I'm interested in the topic of value. Why do we do anything? Why is life worth living? How does this relate to what we would call Platonic forms or idealism, phenomenology, experience in time? And how do all of these things wrap back around and give us a better understanding of God and our role in existence with God? And to close, there is a phrase from Wittgenstein that which cannot be said must remain silent. And I fully agree with that. And I think that ties into the sort of right hemisphere mode of being in the world that is maybe less chatter and more direct experience and meaning. But I think there's also a rebuttal to that, which is that there's something useful in talking around the transcendent ideals, almost like tangents on a circle for the mathematicians out there, all the geometry buffs. So you think about what a tangent is on a circle. It's this line that grazes as if it were the outside of a circle. And if you can do that so many times, you can approximate the sphere, the circular nature of the shape itself. You can never draw a perfectly round circle with just tangents, but you can approximate it. So you can see the form of the circle with these sort of individual lines that all aggregate to form something bigger than each of them could on their own. And these tangents are like the Zen Buddhist idiom of the finger that points to the moon is not the moon itself. Now, what does this mean? We have these tangents that are encompassing a circle, circumscribing the circle itself even, but they are not a circle. They form a halo around the circle. They are useful in identifying the circle, but the tangents do not form a circle. Just in the same way that a finger that points to the moon lines up to the moon. Look, there it is. That does not mean that the finger has become the moon. The thing signified, the moon in this question, is not the same as the signifier, the finger in this question. The tangents to the circle, the word to the thing being referenced, they are not the same. It is easy to make an equative relationship between those two things, the finger and the moon, the tangents and the circle, the word and the thing being referenced. But ultimately, they are not the same. That doesn't mean that we give up on the enterprise of trying to understand things that are transcendent, that are bigger than ourselves, and our sort of concrete left hemisphere understanding of the world. But that does mean that we always need to approach these things, the as if it were entities in life, with a level of humility. And what is humility? Humility is related to the Latin word humus, which means soil. So to be grounded, in touch with what is real, with the earth, and to never let oneself get too high up in the clouds as to forget where you came from and what is ultimately real. Even just that metaphor alone of sort of up and down, being down on the earth and up in the clouds, that we use that to represent this very abstract sort of intellectual relationship between being down in the world and up in intellectual abstractions, how interesting is it that we use that analogy to mean this thing in an intellectual space? And I think that has a lot to do with the as if it were qualities of speech, of what is real in the world. And in the near future, I'm going to be reading through a few essays that I've written about as if it were, what it means, how to use it as a concept. And I hope that you enjoy it, because at the end of the day, these are the kinds of things that I'm just interested in, and I want to talk about them. And you guys are here, and you're listening to me, which I appreciate. So stick around, and coming to you soon, I will be talking more about the as if it were nature of reality, and many, many, many more things. I think you're going to like them. I think you'll like them a lot. And until next time, this has been Jacob and the Polysophical Society.